The cold had arrived early that year, much earlier than anyone inside the castle had expected. It announced itself not through snow or wind, but through a kind of stillness that settled over everything, a strange and heavy quiet that pressed against the senses. The servants were the first to notice it. They spoke in hushed voices about how the corridors no longer echoed the way they used to, how sound seemed to fall flat against the stone walls. Even the smallest noise, a dropped spoon, the creak of wooden beams, the whisper of fabric brushing against the floor, felt amplified, as though the castle itself was listening. By the time the nobles paid attention, winter had already dug its claws deep into the fortress. Every stone in the castle felt colder than iron. Touching the walls for more than a heartbeat made fingers ache. Torches struggled to stay lit, their flames thin and trembling, fighting against drafts that drifted in from cracks too small to see, but far too many to count. The castle had been built to withstand sieges, storms, and invading armies, but it had never been designed with comfort in mind. Strength and grandeur mattered far more than warmth. As the temperature dropped, that truth became impossible to ignore. At sunrise, if the dim bluish haze that seeped into the sky could still be called sunrise, the residents moved like ghosts through the corridors. Breath fogged in front of every mouth, lingering for a moment before dissolving into the frigid air. Hands wrapped in wool or leather struggled to grip tools and trays. The cold made even simple movements stiff and awkward. Joints ached, skin cracked, lips bled. The castle's great hall, once the heart of daily life, became a battleground between fire and frost. The hearth roared with an enormous flame, fed constantly by servants hauling in logs so large 2 men had to carry each one. The fire should have warmed the entire hall. Instead, its heat barely reached a circle of a few meters, a trembling bubble of warmth surrounded by a sea of biting air. People gathered around it whenever they could, closer than politeness usually allowed, huddled together as if proximity alone could keep winter at bay. Yet even there, close to the fire's glow, the cold never truly left. It lingered in the spaces beneath tables and chairs, crawled along the floor, slipped into sleeves and collars. It waited patiently, ready to reclaim whatever tiny pockets of warmth the people managed to create. The nights were far worse. Once darkness smothered the castle, the temperature plunged with frightening speed. Bedroom chambers, grand spaces meant to signify wealth and authority, became unbearable the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Stone floors radiated cold upward like an icy fog. Curtains stiffened. Water basins froze solid overnight. Even ink in inkwells turned thick and sluggish. To sleep alone became almost unthinkable. Servants abandoned their separate quarters and gathered together in the largest rooms, forming piles of blankets, furs, and exhausted bodies. Nobles, too proud to admit the hardship, quietly began doing the same. Husbands and wives who normally slept apart, each in their own chamber according to status, now shared whatever warmth their bodies could muster. The beds themselves became fortresses within a fortress. Heavy drapes were pulled tight around them to trap the heat. Beneath the sheets, layers upon layers of cloth created makeshift insulation. Heated stones wrapped in thick fabric were tucked near the feet, glowing like captive embers. They cooled quickly, but in those first few precious hours, they were salvation. Those who ventured into hallways at night encountered a different world entirely, a kingdom of shadows and frozen air. The dim torchlight created long-reaching silhouettes that wavered with every gust of wind, sneaking in through arrow slits. Stone statues lining the passageways appeared almost alive, their surfaces glazed with thin layers of frost that sparkled like enchanted armor. Walking past them could feel like passing silent sentinels, guardians carved of ice watching without emotion. The sounds of the castle changed as well. The wooden beams in the ceilings groaned and cracked as the cold tightened them, echoing like distant footsteps or muffled whispers. The wind outside scraped across the walls with long, mournful howls. Inside, the faint dripping of melting icicles formed irregular rhythms, each drop startlingly loud in the stillness. It was no longer simply winter. It was an adversary, a relentless presence, creeping into every corner of the castle, challenging everyone who lived within its walls. Yet despite all this, life had to continue. Fires needed feeding. Animals in the stables needed tending. Food supplies had to be rationed and checked daily. for nothing spoiled in the cold, but nothing thawed either. Every task took twice as long, every breath burned in the lungs. Still, the people endured, telling themselves that the cold would ease eventually, that this was only the beginning of a season they had survived before. But deep down, beneath the layers of cloth and pride and bravado, they knew something was different this time. The winter had arrived early, and it felt as though it intended to stay. The cold did more than chill the air. It reshaped the entire rhythm of life inside the castle. It dictated when people woke, when they worked, when they dared move through the corridors, and when they retreated into whatever pockets of warmth they could construct. Even the castle's most powerful inhabitants were forced to bend to its will. Morning began, not with birdsong or sunlight, but with the crack of splitting firewood. The sound echoed across the courtyard as the woodcutters swung their axes again and again, their hands wrapped in so many layers of cloth they could barely grip the handles. Each strike sent vibrations through the frozen ground. Frost exploded from the logs in tiny white bursts, drifting through the air like powdered glass. Inside, the kitchens were already alive with activity. The cooks, wrapped in wool cloaks so thick they moved like bundled spheres, huddled around the massive stone stoves that radiated the only true heat in the entire fortress. Steam rose in rolling waves as pots simmered with broth, making the warm, fragrant air feel almost holy to those who entered. Servants lingered in the kitchens far longer than necessary, offering to fetch water or chop vegetables, anything that granted an excuse to stay in the warmth just a little longer. It became a kind of open secret. The kitchen was the heart of the castle now, not the throne room, not the great hall. It was the only space where breath didn't fog in front of your face. Meanwhile, the castle steward paced through the storerooms with a constant tension tightening his jaw. He held a ledger close to his chest like a shield, flipping through its pages again and again, checking and rechecking the dwindling supplies: barrels of grain, crates of dried meat, bundles of wool, tallow for candles, firewood. Always the firewood, especially the firewood. The steward knew precisely how much wood the castle consumed each day. He knew how many days of winter lay ahead, and he knew that if the cold continued at this rate, sharp, early, unforgiving, they would be forced to ration heat long before spring arrived. The idea gnawed at him, a worry so constant it haunted him in the few hours he managed to sleep. By midday, the noble family would gather in the solar, the warmest room by design, built to trap sunlight when the sun was still visible in winter skies. But this year, sunlight was a rumor. A thin, weak glow struggled through the narrow windows, landing on the stone floor like pale silver water. The nobles sat close together, cloaks wrapped around their shoulders, sipping spiced wine that cooled the moment it was poured. The lord of the castle, usually commanding and proud, now kept one hand constantly near the brazier beside his chair. His skin, once sun-browned from summer hunts, had taken on the pallor of a man at war with the weather itself. Frost threaded through his beard each morning. His breath whistled through clenched teeth. He wasn't alone in his discomfort. The lady of the castle, elegant even in layers of wool and fur, found her fingers stiffening so severely that she could no longer sew without pausing to warm her hands by a candle flame every few minutes. The children, restless and energetic by nature, were forced to play in the solar where the floors weren't painfully cold. Their laughter echoed off the walls, but even that vibrant sound felt muted, dampened by the weight of the cold surrounding them. Beyond the solar, life continued in quieter, harsher ways. The guards, men sworn to protect the fortress, marched their patrol routes bundled in so many layers that they resembled moving bundles of cloth with helmets perched on top. Their armor, too cold to wear directly against the skin, was lined with strips of fur. Metal that ordinarily gleamed with pride was now dulled by frost. When they exhaled, icy clouds billowed from inside their helmets like smoke from a dragon's maw. The stables became another battlefield for warmth. Horses stamped their hooves restlessly, vapor rising from their nostrils in thick plumes. The stable hands worked tirelessly to keep water buckets from freezing solid, cracking ice with the blunt ends of tools. They rubbed the horses' legs to keep circulation flowing, whispering apologies into shaggy winter coats as the animals shifted restlessly, sensing the unnatural severity of the season. Even the castle's dogs, normally fierce guardians of the grounds, abandoned their nightly patrols and clustered near the human fires, trembling beneath layers of straw and blankets. They were loyal, but even loyalty had limits when the world turned this cold. As the day wore on, the effects of the cold began to seep into the castle's structure. Ice crept across the inside of the windows like delicate white lace. Water dripped slowly from the ceilings, where warmth from the fireplaces met the frozen stone overhead. Tapestries, normally stiff ornaments of decoration, softened with the moisture, sagging slightly on their hooks. Everywhere the cold left its fingerprints, but the true danger came when the sun began to sink. All through the castle, people moved with urgency. Fires were stoked, wood was distributed, blankets were carried, curtains were drawn tight, doors were sealed with cloth to block drafts. It was a ritual repeated night after night, a silent acknowledgement that the real struggle was only hours away. For when darkness took hold, the castle changed again. The temperature plunged to a level that made the air itself feel heavier, thicker, almost difficult to breathe. Breath turned to frost on eyelashes, skin numbed within seconds. Fear, though rarely spoken, settled into the hearts of everyone. They all understood what the night meant, the coldest hours, the most dangerous hours, a time when even the strongest fires faltered. And yet, in the midst of this relentless winter, life continued. The castle endured. People adapted, endured, and survived, because that was what humans always did when pushed against the edge. But with each passing day, whispers began to spread, quiet comments shared in hallways and kitchens, murmured when the wind was howling loudly enough to cover the words. This winter was not normal. This cold felt wrong, and some said the castle felt different too, like it was waiting, watching, listening, alive. Night inside the castle was not merely darkness, it was a force, a presence, a weight that settled over the fortress like a second layer of stone. The fires dimmed, the torches burned lower. The air temperature dropped so sharply that it felt as though the walls themselves exhaled frost. Those who lived through it often said that the castle was at its coldest. Not at midnight, nor just before dawn, but in the strange hollow of time that existed between them, a stretch of hours where even the moon felt distant and the world outside seemed erased. This was the hour when the corridors groaned. The sound was subtle at first, a low and uncertain moan from deep within the walls. Stone expanded and contracted under intense cold, creating a chorus of muffled cracks and sighs that echoed like footsteps. Servants sleeping in side chambers often woke with their hearts pounding, convinced that someone, or something, was walking past their doors. Some whispered that the castle spoke at night. Others whispered that it listened. The guards on duty knew better than anyone what these hours felt like. Wrapped in cloaks that barely held back the cold, they walked their patrol routes with lanterns that flickered violently in the drafts. Each guard carried a small vial of warm oil inside their tunic to keep their fingers from freezing stiff around their weapons. More than one guard had been found at dawn leaning against a wall, eyes closed, completely still, overcome by cold so quietly that it appeared as though they had simply drifted into sleep and never returned from it. Because in this place, freezing to death was never dramatic. It was silent, slow, almost gentle, a thief of warmth rather than a murderer, and everyone inside the castle knew it. To combat this threat, families clustered together at night. Privacy vanished, replaced by layers of blankets, woolen curtains, and the shared body heat of those desperate to make it to morning. Entire wings of the castle turned into communal sleeping chambers. Children curled against their parents. Servants slept near nobles with no shame or hesitation. Even warriors, hardened and proud, lay shoulder to shoulder with strangers when the cold deepened enough to threaten their lives. But not everyone chose company. Some preferred solitude, or required it. Like the castle's scholar, an elderly man named Idran, who insisted on sleeping in the library, claiming he must guard the manuscripts from moisture and frost. His colleagues whispered that the cold was driving him into obsession, but Idran refused to leave. He spent each night wrapped in furs, surrounded by piles of ancient texts. scribbling notes by candlelight as his breath filled the room with ghostly fog. He believed the winter was more than weather. He believed it was history repeating itself. One night, as the wind howled like a living creature outside the tall, narrow windows, Adrian found a crumbling page in an old chronicle that described a winter very much like this one. Violent, early, unnatural. Entire villages had vanished under its weight. Castles had lost more people to cold than to war. There were mentions, half legend, half warning, of an ice wind that carried sickness, madness, and despair. It wasn't just a storm, it was an event, a phenomenon, a trial. Adrian copied the passage twice, his trembling hands trying to steady the quill. He wanted to warn the lord of the castle, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was fear of being dismissed as paranoid, or perhaps because deep down he sensed the truth. No one could stop this winter, not even the lord, not the steward, not the guards, not the cooks with their warm kitchens, not the families huddled together in makeshift warmth. The castle was enduring something ancient, something that had happened before, something that would happen again. He decided he would wait until morning to share his findings. After all, the castle always felt safer in daylight, less oppressive, less alive. But until morning came, he had hours to sit with the knowledge that they were facing a danger far older and far more powerful than they had assumed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the fortress, another kind of fear spread quietly. The servants in the laundry hall noticed that no matter how many times they dried the bedding, it returned damp the next day. Not wet, damp, as if the cold itself was seeping into the cloth. The maid responsible for the lord's chambers reported that the heavy curtains, thick wool imported at great expense, were developing beads of frost along the edges. The steward found several recently delivered sacks of grain, frozen solid in the storeroom, despite being kept indoors. The blacksmith discovered ice forming on the inside of his forge door. The head cook found frost growing on a pan that hadn't been washed yet, as if the cold had targeted it deliberately. Small things, individually manageable, together unsettling. Then came the night when the wind forced its way through a sealed tower window. Not a crack, not a draught, but a roar of ice-cold air so powerful it snuffed out every candle on that floor. Servants screamed, guards rushed in. By the time they arrived, frost coated the walls, the ceiling, even the stone floor in a layer so thick it resembled crushed diamonds under torchlight. The window had not broken. The window had not opened. The cold had simply entered, as if it had chosen to, as if it knew the way. That night changed everything. The lord ordered double firewood rations for the towers. The steward calculated and recalculated again, each time looking more pale. The guards shortened their patrol rotations. Families slept even closer together. And rumors, that thing humans always create when fear grows faster than explanations, spread like wildfire. Some said the castle was cursed. Some said the winter was a test of faith. Some said ghosts of the castle's original builders walked the halls at night, bringing the cold with them. Others whispered of something darker, an ancient presence awakened by the winter. None of these stories were spoken by daylight, but at night, when the corridors groaned and the torches flickered and the air froze inside your lungs, everyone wondered, everyone feared, everyone listened. Dawn came later now, not because the sun rose any differently, but because the castle seemed determined to hold on to the night for as long as possible. Even when daylight finally pierced the sky, the courtyard remained dim, as though the cold itself swallowed the light before it reached the ground. Everyone felt it. Everyone moved slower, not from exhaustion, though winter brought plenty of that, but from something deeper, a kind of heaviness that clung to the body and clouded the mind. The castle's lord, a man accustomed to command and strategy, now found his authority challenged not by rivals or armies, but by the creeping dread settling among his people. Each morning brought reports of new incidents, small enough to doubt, but too many to ignore. Doors freezing shut from the inside, candles going out in rooms fully sealed, bread hardening overnight as if it were stone. The lord gathered his council in the great hall, a cavernous chamber designed for feasts and diplomacy, now colder than the courtyard outside. Even with the massive hearth blazing, The heat rose only a few feet before vanishing into the vast, shadowed space above. The councillors huddled close to the fire, their breath misting like steam from startled horses. "Winter is winter," grumbled one of the knights, a veteran who had survived blizzards on distant battlefields. "It bites, it tests us, it leaves. This is nothing new." But his voice wavered. He wasn't convincing anyone, not even himself. The steward unrolled a long parchment scroll covered in charcoal notes. "We have enough firewood for 21 days, he announced. "Less if the towers continue consuming fuel at their current pace." Silence. A long, sinking silence. 21 days meant survival, as long as winter behaved like winter. But this winter behaved like something else. "We ration," the Lord commanded. Effective immediately. There were murmurs of discontent. Rations meant colder nights, fewer hot meals, and no margin for error. But everyone obeyed. They always obeyed. For now. While the council debated survival strategies, the inhabitants of the castle faced struggles much closer to bone and skin. Servants wrapped their feet in cloth strips before putting on shoes, knowing frostbite could strike even indoors. Children carried warmed stones in their pockets, gripping them like talismans of safety. Workers stopped using the far stairwell after 2 people slipped on the invisible film of ice that seemed to regenerate hourly. The blacksmith, once the heartiest soul in the fortress, now had to heat his tools twice as long. The leather workers found their materials stiff as boards. The stable hands discovered frost forming on the horses' manes inside the stalls, and the animals. They sensed something the humans did not. They grew restless, unpredictable, eyes wide in the dimness, breaths sharp and panicked. In harsh winters, animals sought warmth. In this winter, they sought escape. The turning point arrived quietly. It always does. Late one evening, a servant girl was carrying blankets from one wing to another when she heard a strange sound, a rhythmic tapping, soft and cold, almost like fingernails on stone. She froze. The corridor was empty, only torchlight flickering against the walls, but the tapping continued, getting closer. She turned the corner and saw nothing. Just a long hallway lined with old wooden doors, but frost was spreading across the floor, creeping toward her in delicate branching veins. It inched forward like a living thing, glimmering in the torchlight as the temperature plunged around her. She backed away. The frost followed. Her lantern went out, not dimmed, not sputtered, snuffed out. She ran. When she reached the main hall, the guards dismissed her story as fear and imagination, until they noticed the frost still clinging to her boots, rising up the leather in patterns that resembled grasping fingers. From that night onward, fear became a constant companion. People avoided the northern wing. Doors that once remained open were kept shut, though everyone knew wood had no power against whatever stalked the corridors. The council tried to maintain order, but the atmosphere had changed, subtly at first, then unmistakably. The castle no longer felt defensive, it felt hungry. The scholar Edron felt it most keenly. After discovering the ancient chronicle describing this unnatural cold, he buried himself in research, scouring the library for any hint of a pattern, a warning, a cure. One night, he finally found something. A marginal note scribbled in the faded ink of a monk long dead, nothing more than a few lines squeezed between illustrations as though it had been added in haste. When winter lingers beyond reason, and the stone breathes cold into the living, it is not the season that hunts men, but the memory of the earth before fire. It was cryptic, poetic, and unsettling. The earth before fire, before hearths, before warmth, before survival. It hinted at a cold older than men, older than castles, older than memory, but the scholar had no chance to share his findings. As he leaned closer to examine the script, he saw frost spreading across the wooden table, fine crystals emerging from the grain as if grown from within. He recoiled, knocking over the candle. It went out instantly. When he relit it, the frost was gone. But the table felt ice-cold, as if touched by something with no body, no breath, only intent. Fear drove Edron to the Lord's quarters, and breathless, he explained what he had discovered. The Lord listened carefully. He did not call the scholar mad. He did not dismiss the story, because he too had felt the cold change. That night, the Lord ordered the castle into a new state of vigilance. Guards were assigned to roam the halls in pairs. No one was permitted to sleep alone. Fires were to be maintained at all hours, watched continuously, never allowed to die. But even that felt inadequate, because every night the cold grew sharper, more cunning, more present. It no longer seeped into rooms. It entered them. It no longer waited for nightfall. It moved within the castle as though testing its defenses, and the castle's inhabitants realized something chilling. This winter was not simply happening around them, it was happening to them. And whatever was coming, it had not yet revealed its true purpose. By the time the final week of deep winter arrived, the castle had changed. Not in appearance, though frost now webbed the windows and climbed the stone walls like pale ivy, but in presence. The air itself carried weight, as though something unseen pressed in on all sides. Even the fires seemed smaller, as if shrinking away from something only they could sense. People no longer spoke of the cold. They whispered of it. They no longer wondered when winter would end. They wondered what winter wanted. And the castle felt alive in a way no one could understand. Alive, but not in the warm, celebratory sense the builders had once imagined. It pulsed, breathed, creaked, and groaned like a beast awakening after a centuries-long slumber. On the 7th night of the Lord's strict watch order, a storm descended with no warning, a storm that fell not from clouds, but from silence. No wind, no snow, no thunder, only a suffocating quiet, so absolute that even the guards felt compelled to hold their breath. The torches dimmed, the flames shrank, the air turned brittle, and then it began. A sound echoed from deep within the northern wing, the same tapping the servant girl had heard days earlier, slow, deliberate, too rhythmic to be random, too measured to be wind. The guards closest to the wing froze. They did not approach, they could not. The instinct to run, to flee, to hide, something primal, overtook every man who heard it. The scholar Edrin, who had been poring over the monk's cryptic notes, felt his chest tighten as he read a final line he hadn't noticed before. It was scrawled in the margin, barely legible. It returns when the stones remember. He knew then that whatever haunted the castle was not new. It was old. Older than the castle, older than any kingdom. It was a remnant from a time when warmth did not touch this land, when winter was not a season, but a state of the world. The tapping continued, closer now. Guards retreated from the corridor, their breath fogging violently, their faces draining of color. The Lord arrived moments later, sword drawn, though he knew steel would be worthless. "Show yourself," he shouted. But the corridor answered only with cold, and then the frost came, not creeping, not spreading, surging. A sudden sweep of white across the stones, devouring the floor like a flood of needles. One guard stumbled back, his boots encased in ice so quickly he couldn't lift his feet. Another dropped his torch, which extinguished before it touched the ground. The frost rose. Up the walls, across the ceiling, toward the living. The Lord grabbed the nearest guard and pulled him back, just in time. The man's abandoned boots shattered on the floor, splitting like brittle shells. The frost stopped abruptly, inches from the Lord's own foot, as though it were waiting. The silence returned, and the castle felt colder than at any point in the winter. Not physically, spiritually, a chill that pressed into the soul. Idrin stepped forward, holding the old chronicle close to the torchlight. "There must be a pattern," he whispered, "something in the history of this land." He turned to the Lord, eyes wide. "This castle, it was built on ruins, wasn't it?" The Lord hesitated, then nodded. "On older foundations," he admitted. "Old as the first kings, older perhaps." And suddenly everything made sense. Not in a logical way. Logic had no place here, but in the way a nightmare makes sense while you're trapped inside it. The scholar flipped to the chronicle's earliest entries, records of a time before the castle existed. Accounts of a forgotten settlement, a place abandoned after winters so cruel that villagers believed the earth itself rejected fire. They called it the Hollow Winter, a curse, a memory. a hunger. The tapping sound echoed again, closer, behind them. The lord spun around, but nothing stood in the corridor, only air so cold it shimmered. Something brushed past them, unseen but unmistakable, like the absence of heat given shape. The flames in the torches bowed away from it. Frost traced its movement across the floor. Whatever it was searching. For what, no one knew. The castle groaned violently, as though the stone itself were straining under an invisible pressure. Dust rained from the ceiling. The frost spread faster, reaching doors, climbing tapestries, encasing shields and armor. Idrun shouted over the noise, "It isn't here for us. It's here because we built our home on its grave." The lord pulled people back toward the main hall, shouting orders as the frost chased them step for step. Servants fled. Guards carried children. The great doors slammed shut as the cold thrashed outside, pounding like a fist of air and ice. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The groaning ceased. The frost halted. The tapping vanished. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. And then the torches brightened. Not fully, but enough. The cold retreated slowly, reluctantly, like an animal returning to the forest after a failed hunt. When dawn rose hours later, the castle was quiet. The frost remained, clinging to every surface. But whatever possessed the night had loosened its grip. The storm was over, but winter remained, and it would remain for many weeks. The scholar examined the remnants of frost patterns etched across the stone, intricate branching shapes resembling ancient runes. Some he recognized from old manuscripts. Most he did not. The lord ordered the northern wing sealed permanently. No one argued. As the inhabitants slowly returned to their duties, whispers spread through the castle. Some believed they had survived a haunting. Others believed they had angered something ancient beneath the foundation. A few whispered that the castle had awakened a memory best left forgotten. And centuries later, long after the castle fell into ruin, long after its rooms decayed and its corridors were reclaimed by moss, travelers would still report strange patterns of frost appearing on summer mornings, glistening like thin white scars across the old stones. Cold spots, unnatural drafts, footsteps in empty halls. Legends grew, tales spread. Some said it was a ghost, others said it was a curse. A few scholars suggested geological anomalies, but local villagers generation after generation repeated the same phrase, "The stones remember." And though the castle is silent now, with no fires burning and no voices echoing through its halls, some claim that if you stand there on the coldest nights of the year, you can still hear it. A faint tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, as if winter itself is still searching for a way back in.